Now I'm really excited to introduce our opening speaker, Dave MacLeod. Dave is the CEO and co-founder of the ThoughtExchange, and a really interesting company I got introduced to right at the outset of the pandemic. ThoughtExchange is an innovative company working with organizations across North America, leveraging technology to crowdsource employee, customer, and community insights in order to address some really big challenges and also change through collaboration, understanding, and consensus building. But Dave's also an author, the author of Scaling Conversations, which offers strategies of how leaders can have more inclusive community discussions, empower different voices, scale meaningful conversations as organizations, including those with your employees and your stakeholder base as it grows and becomes perhaps more complex over time. It's now my privilege to introduce Dave MacLeod. Dave, over to you.
Thank you, sir. Quick check that you can see this slide, tech crew, and then B, that it does move on to the next slide when I press something, because this has happened before. So does that, looks good. Everyone see that? Okay. Thanks. And I'm going to try to kick this off and keep the bit rate high on a few things. One, we just mentioned my book. This slide says establishing credibility for a reason, in that who am I to try to talk about this subject? Couple things to know about me. So ThoughtExchange has just about 200 staff now. We're fast growing. I wrote this book called Scaling Conversations. I was actually a face-to-face facilitator with a background in gathering large groups of people, traveling around, working closely with Indigenous populations and communities. And the book, actually, I'm just going to put it in the chat here, because this is a link that anybody attending this can have a free copy of it if you like on me. Trying to spread the word about conversations, which is the essence of what I'm going to present about here for the next just under 15 minutes. So we're a discussion tech company. We're fast growth, quartz top promote company, millions of participants used by the world's leading private and public institutions. I say all of this so that when I present, you can go, okay, well, he has worked with GE and Microsoft, as well as school districts and government organizations. The point is, how do you have a conversation that includes everyone, where you can discover actions and create alignment? I'm not going to present about ThoughtExchange in this. I'm actually going to talk about a conversation, but in the meantime, I hope you don't multitask. I'm going to put this second link into this chat, which is something I'd invite you to do afterwards. This is a conversation just got launched on LinkedIn this morning about vaccinations, mandatory vaccinations, the corporate response to vaccinations. A group of leaders is getting together to discuss this and looking for perspectives that need to be thought about as organizations deal with whether or not to mandate, etc. That is a ThoughtExchange. That's the only part I'm going to do about ThoughtExchange. I'm actually going to dive into what is a conversation to help get our panel into something interesting. First thing, I want to acknowledge a couple things. One, I'm here talking to you as a white guy named Dave, who's 6 foot tall, and there's been 18 members of the Fortune 500 that have been African American since the inception, and thousands of people that are not, that are white. And there has been many studies that show there are more men named Dave in the Fortune 500 than there are total women in the Fortune 500. And the aggregate height is 6 foot tall, and I am 6 foot tall. My name's Dave, I'm white. And I want to note that this is not a conversation we're having. I'm actually speaking at you, introduced by a white male, and then a white male, and I'm a white male, and I'm going to panel with a white male led by a woman who is going to talk about. I want to bring up these topics because I think this is an opportunity to really consider what's possible. In that today, I can't even ask you for a comment in this. I can't even get a chit chat going. We'll do a quick Q&A at the end. It'll be sort of safe. But what is a conversation? How do I have a conversation digitally? It's possible, except we need to actually unpack what it is first. So I'm going to talk about a few things here as we dive in. So a conversation is a safe place to share a thought, a fair process for each thought to be considered equally, and tools to understand what matters most. I'm going to unpack what I mean by that. But I'd like you to think about safety. So here's a real limiting leader belief. And this company that we started is about 10 years old. And I used to speak with corporate executives and say, hey, there's a way you can talk to 1,000 people, and we're actually going to remove their identity to protect them so they'll tell you the truth. And the number of times I heard, if someone has something to say, you know what, they should have the professionalism and courage to say that to my face. This is a limiting leader belief for the following reason. There's the leader who said it, and there's the amount of feedback they're getting from the two people they talk to. There's everybody else who might give them interesting insight into their business, into their strategy, into things they're concerned about. But there's really solid reasons why they're not providing that have to do with things like career limiting. Do you really want to challenge your boss in front of them? Has to do with sexism. It is out there amid every organization in the world. It has to do with systemic racism, that out there, it's acknowledged. It has to do with a lot of reasons why people say, you know what, it's not necessarily safe for me to challenge something that I might know is deeply wrong. And leaders that don't acknowledge this are just not getting the truth. The next piece, though, is fair process. I say this in that I'd love to have a conversation with everybody here. And in order for it to be a conversation, everyone's thought has to be actually heard and considered in an equal way. And the question I have related to this is, do you want your thoughts to be heard and considered equally? And I left this space intentionally blank because it's such a redundant question. The next piece is here, though, is tools to understand importance. I want to leave you with an image. Is a waiter walks in and says, what would you like to drink? People say, I don't know, I'd like a beer. Sure, beer, give me a beer. Yep, beer sounds great. Why not? Give me a beer. And then someone says, I don't know, it's the last day of summer. Don't you make an amazing margarita? I'd like a margarita. And everyone goes, oh. Now that's interesting. Yeah, you know what? I'd also like a margarita. That sounds great. Yeah, no, you know what? Me too. You know what? Round of margaritas, right? Except for one person said, no, I'm going to hold out with my beer. The reason I bring that up is the tool to understand importance there was that everybody was in the same room and were able to think about what someone else said and actually change their world viewpoint and arrive at something different. If you just actually studied the responses of those people, 7 of 8 people prefer beer. One person prefers margarita. They probably don't like it all that much. It's not true. Conversationally, as humans, conversations are a competitive advantage. Our ability to learn from each other, change our viewpoint, adapt, and move forward is how we do things. But unless we have a tool where we can consider the thinking of other people, it doesn't work. So I just want to talk about conversations are the way to build trust, but why don't they scale, right? So I'm going to go through 3 things. One is, how many times have you said in a group of people or like this on a web meeting, hey, everyone, I'm just curious, yeah, you know, what does everybody think about this? In a group of more than 10, what happens? Crickets. Or you wait for one person to either say something that agrees with you and either look bad because they agreed with you maybe too much, or they challenge you, but maybe that was nervous making because they challenged you. But when you talk to a group that's larger than 6, 7 people, you can have a good conversation with 6 or 7, but as soon as you have more than that, it turns into this thing I'm in right now, which is speaking at you. And it's tough to get any sort of feedback. And even if you're in a live room with 30 people, anyone have something to say? Crickets. But I want to talk about the second problem, which is loud voices. Loud voices have changed. I want you to picture that extended family member, each of you to do this right now. Picture that person who posts on social media every time something political happens. Everyone's got somebody in their family that does this. Maybe it's you. The question number 1 is, does that person fairly represent you and your family when they do such a thing? That again is a rhetorical question, and I can't have you answer anyways. But the answer is generally no. That person might be a little bit more radical. But what do you and your family do about that? Because is it fair that people might say, well, interesting, that person thinks that, maybe that whole group of people think that. What do you do about that? Do you then go all on social media as a family and say, you know what, let's actually construct a way to put posts and say, actually, this doesn't fairly represent, and all of us want to gather around and share that this isn't necessarily representative of our group? No, you don't do that. You phone each other and say, God, can you believe what they just put on social media? Beneath the fold, you have this conversation where the loud voices out there speaking. Beneath the fold, people that disagree are disagreeing sort of silently around. And there's small polarizing conversations that are happening in front of everybody. Enormous under the fold conversations happening about more moderate points of view. Okay. The last one, though, I want to talk about is bias. One of the reasons why conversations don't scale is that, first of all, there's 3 kinds of bias. There's the ones you know, you listen to more people who look like you, so you try to work around that. There's biases that you don't know, like you have an unknown effect on people based on your attributes. You're like, yeah, I could believe that to be possible. Maybe, I guess so. But then there's biases that you don't know, and you don't even know you don't know them. If you want to get a bit of a scare today, Google parole granted after lunch. This is just basically shows that hangry bias is a thing, that you're much more likely to get parole if your parole hearing happens to be just after lunch instead of just before lunch. I just outlined that because it's something I was like, wow, I never would have thought of that. That seems sort of significant to those people still in jail. However, it's these things that guide us that make, well, I don't even know why I don't listen to a viewpoint. I just don't value it. Why is that? We aren't built to really scale. There needs to be technology, in my opinion, to augment our infinite ability to bias against each other. So with that, I want to segue into the second part of this to help prep us for the panel conversation that's coming up. Is a conversation is at the heart of humanity. It's at the heart of why we're able to talk across kin groups, remember promises that we've made to each other, build trust, hear each other out, listen. It's how we build relationships with our loved ones, with our families, with our employees, with our community. So, but why do we need to scale them in this essence, as far as this BCBC topic? Well, let's talk about capital for a minute. So I want to talk about capital as the assets that you have available for your purpose. That can include cash, but also includes a lot of other stuff. And I'm going to unpack a few different kinds of capital here for us to consider. And I'm going to do that by showing you this. This is the crisis cycle. At the bottom, you have a lot of pain. At the top, you have a lot of joy. So here's what happens is that you have a crisis, then you have this big reaction that's kind of positive and you're working your way through it. Then you have another crisis, then you have this big change that happens, then you have another crisis, and then something else happens. We all are very aware of crisis in the last couple of years, but in fact, in our life, it kind of looks like this. You sort of start in your first crisis is you have to go to school or something. But then you go and you find your first girlfriend, and then you get dumped by your first girlfriend, but maybe then you graduate and that's great. But then you end up hating university, but then you find your spouse, and then you get a divorce, and then you end up finding your amazing career and a new spouse, but then your parent dies of cancer and you go back into crisis. You go up and down like this, and ultimately you die. And so at the end, it could be seen that life basically goes up and down and up and down, and then it's just crisis, and then we're dead, and that kind of sucks. But there's good news related to this crisis cycle, is that as we go through these things, if you think about the people in your life that you have the deepest connections with, the most meaningful connections with, actually, if you picture them, are they there just at the top there when things are going really well? Or are they there for you in the bottom parts? Again, another rhetorical question, since I can't actually ask you. But the answer is that, of course, they're there both at the top and the bottom. They're there at the hard times. They're there to celebrate your victories. So the truth is that each time you have a crisis, it's another opportunity to build connection with people. The more times you've gone through challenge is the more opportunity to actually be connected with one another. So why is that important? Well, navigating constant crisis actually creates a constant opportunity to create connection. Just like your life, as you go through things, you can either take each thing as an opportunity to soften and grow, or you can just say and negate the learning and end up in crisis and you're dead and it's over. But if you take each opportunity to go through crisis and change as an opportunity to learn and soften, at the end of your life, you actually end up at a much better place than where you started. Okay. The capital that I want to unpack related to that, though, is that right now, there's never been a more important time to build capital in our organizations in order to create great outcomes for our shareholders as well as for our employees. Relationship capital is called Be That Friend. I'm going to unpack that. Picture that friend who you know that when they want something, when the phone rings, they want something. They're just like, you almost don't want to pick up the phone because you're like, I just can't deal with this person calling me right now. Otherwise, that person would never, ever call you. Now picture another friend you're going to rush to buy lunch for them before they buy lunch for you, right? And it doesn't matter. You don't keep track of who actually bought lunch the last time. The difference between those two people is relationship capital, but I'm going to unpack that for you in an interesting way. Relationship capital is actually built by asking questions about things that you don't actually have an agenda or a need to ask those sort of questions. You just want to hear them out. What challenges are you experiencing? Just curious. If remote work is going to continue, what are concerns? What advice do you have? I just want to know. What are some hopes and concerns you have about our future? I just am curious. Not specific, what are the 3 things we need to action right now? What are the most important things that you're facing right now so I can do something about that? Relationship capital is actually built by being genuinely interested in the other person's experience without any preconceived notions of a transactional return. All right, I got two more. Process capital, process capital. You can tell I work across North America. Never about me without me. Never about me without me is a really important term for people to be thinking about as we start to increase the social connection with people. There's an interesting thing here that you can learn about. Happy to share. It's in the book as well. Humans are statistically much more willing to embrace bad decisions with a good process than a good decision. Isn't that fascinating? But really, it actually kind of makes sense. If you believe that the decision was made in a good way, well, you're saying, well, actually, so maybe that wasn't the best decision, but I really like that you asked everybody. I liked your process. It was a fair process in how you made that decision. So I guess I'll go with it. Versus, this is what we're doing. How'd you make that decision? I'm not going to tell you. Well, do I know if it's the best decision or not? Don't worry, it's the best decision. It doesn't work. The reason why it doesn't work is you're not building process capital where people actually say, I believe in how you make decisions, right? So organizations right now that have a great decision process and also make really good decisions are going to have the most people amidst this great resignation that's happening, as well as support afterwards. So process capital is things like what's working well and challenges we're facing as we hire and promote more diverse team members. Becoming diverse is something that's important for organizations. So what's your process for doing that and how are you communicating it? What are your concerns and thoughts as we make plans during this big reopening? What does leadership need to consider as we work through change? The last one I'm going to talk about is ownership capital, which is the whole thing here is don't engage, unify. I'm going to get you to think about something that I hope makes you itchy. And in fact, it's the title of this. How do you feel if your boss or your board, someone comes to you right now and says, hey, I really want to engage you in your work? They say that sentence to you. I want to engage you in your work. How do you feel? Hint, you feel, sorry, I think I'm already kind of engaged in my work. Thank you very much. The truth is this idea of engagement is at the heart of ESG, is the idea that people actually need unification, their effort with your effort. Every time you talk about engagement, you are showing that there is a difference between you and them. When people try to engage you, it's because they assume you're not. So just think about the language of unity versus engagement, because people help support things they create, right? So if you start to think about your language of engagement and turn it into things, the language of unity, and say, actually, I'm just trying to make sure that your efforts and our efforts are best aligned. Well, that's really interesting because ownership isn't limited to material things. It can also apply to points of view, but it also applies to material things. So let's not forget about that part. And let's just think about ownership capital and things like, what do we need to understand as we update our strategy? What do you need to achieve our revenue goals? What cost savings options could we consider? This is final concept I'm going to leave you with. Last slide is next. The hierarchy of questions is really important here. The concept here is that in order to build organizational trust and efficiency, if you ask about culture and vision, you'll actually destroy every bit of capital you've created when safety and structure aren't present. Picture somebody who looks upset walking to your office and they're very upset, and you sit down in front of you and you say, wait, before you say anything, could you please tell me 3 things you appreciate about our organization and 2 of your big hopes for our 2030 vision? Of course, you'd never do that, but we're doing that all the time. This is the last slide for you, which is the idea that Maslow's hierarchy of needs clearly shows. He also works with Blackfoot elders in order to refine his thinking on this and think of a multi-generational point of view. But the idea is that humans need to have safety and security addressed in order for your organization to be a transformational organization that is a business leader. So the good news is you can work your way up. The bad news is if you don't have conversations around safety and security, structure and process, people and connection in that order, when you go to talk about vision and purpose, people cannot hear you. All right, so that's my spiel on scaling conversations and why they're important and maybe some of the mistakes people are making. And with that, I'm gonna stop sharing my screen and get to the conversation part.